October 15, 1944. Across the Canadian prairies, the harvest season was drawing to a close as farmers brought in the last of their wheat crops under endless skies. In small towns from Manitoba to Alberta, families gathered for Sunday dinners, grateful that the war remained an ocean away from their doorsteps. But at a modest prisoner of war camp outside Medicine Hat, Alberta, something unprecedented was about to unfold. When a transport truck carrying 37 German women prisoners pulled through the gates, Sergeant Malcolm Fraser did something that would challenge everything these women believed about their enemies. He welcomed them with a feast. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the Allied advance through France in the final months of the European campaign. Young women ranging in age from 19 to 34, who had served the Reich as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel. Now they stood on foreign soil, thousands of miles from home, expecting the harsh treatment that propaganda had promised them at the hands of the Allies. What they received instead would transform their understanding of everything they thought they knew about the world. Before we discover what happened when these German women tasted freedom in the form of a purple prairie dessert, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The women stepped down from the truck in a cold drizzle, their gray auxiliary uniforms worn and stained from weeks of transit. They had traveled by ship across the Atlantic, then by train across the vast emptiness of the Canadian interior, watching through barred windows as forests gave way to prairies that seemed to stretch forever. Among them was 23-year-old Dorothea Keller, a former communications specialist from Stuttgart. She clutched a small canvas bag containing the only possessions she had left, a comb, a photograph of her family, and a wooden cross her mother had pressed into her hands when she left for military service 2 years earlier. Captain Dorothy Whitmore stood waiting for them, her posture military, but her expression unexpectedly calm. She was one of only a handful of female officers in the Canadian military, assigned to oversee this unusual facility that housed enemy women rather than men. As the prisoners formed an uncertain line, Captain Whitmore addressed them in clear, measured English that few of them fully understood. "Welcome to Camp Medicine Hat. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be given shelter, food, and medical care. You are prisoners, but you are also under our protection." The words meant little to most of the women, but the tone registered something they hadn't expected. There was no cruelty in the captain's voice, no hatred. Dorothea exchanged glances with Hildegard Schmidt, a former nurse from Munich who stood beside her. They had become something, like friends during the long journey, bound together by shared fear and uncertainty. Hilda's blue eyes reflected the same confusion Dorothea felt. This was not what they had been prepared for. The German women were led through the camp compound, their boots squelching in the mud as rain continued to fall across the prairie landscape. The facility was smaller than the massive prisoner of war camps they had heard about, just a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. But what struck Dorothea most was the absence of hostility in the faces of the Canadian guards who watched them pass. There was curiosity in their expressions, perhaps even pity, but not the hatred she had been taught to expect from enemy soldiers. They were taken to a barracks that had been prepared for their arrival. Inside, they found rows of clean cots with folded blankets, a wood stove already burning to chase away the October chill, and windows that, while barred, were clean and let in the gray afternoon light. Elfriede Zimmermann, a former administrative clerk from Hamburg, ran her hand along one of the rough wool blankets and whispered in German to no one in particular, "This is better than our quarters in France during the retreat." The other women nodded in silent agreement, their faces revealing the exhaustion of months spent fleeing before the Allied advance. Captain Whitmore allowed them an hour to settle in before announcing through a translator that dinner would be served in the main hall. The women filed into the dining facility with military precision, their training asserting itself even in captivity. What they found inside stopped them in their tracks. Long tables had been set with plates, actual ceramic plates, rather than the tin mess kits they expected. At each place setting sat utensils, cloth napkins, and something that made Dorothea's heart ache with unexpected emotion. A small vase with prairie wildflowers, their colors muted but still beautiful against the plain wooden tables. Sergeant Malcolm Fraser, a broad-shouldered man with weather-worn hands and kind eyes, stood at the front of the hall. Beside him was an older woman in a simple dress and apron, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. "This is Mrs. Beatrice Campbell," the sergeant said, gesturing to the woman. "She's volunteered to help with meals here at the camp. Tonight she's prepared a proper Canadian welcome dinner." The translator, a young private René Dupuis, whose grandmother had been French, carefully rendered the words into German. But it was what came next that truly shocked the prisoners. The guards and staff began bringing out serving dishes laden with food: roasted chicken, glazed with herbs and butter, mashed potatoes with gravy, carrots and turnips from local farms, fresh bread still warm with real butter. And then, carried in with almost ceremonial care by Mrs. Campbell herself, came dessert. Rows of individual tarts, their crusts golden and flaky, filled with a deep purple filling that gleamed in the lamplight. The aroma that filled the hall was unlike anything the women had smelled in months, sweet and rich and impossibly abundant. Gertrude Schaefer, the youngest of the prisoners at just 19, stared at the feast before them with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Why," she whispered, in German, to Lieselotte Bauer beside her, "why would they feed us like this? We are their enemies." Lieselotte, older and more cynical at 32, had no answer. She simply shook her head in bewilderment, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her fork. The German women sat frozen at the tables, their military training warring with their hunger and confusion. Captain Whitmore made a simple gesture, indicating they should begin eating. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Dorothea, driven by a hunger that had been her constant companion for months, picked up her fork. The other women watched her, and slowly, hesitantly, they followed her lead. The first bite of warm food, real food, not the watery soup and stale bread they had subsisted on during the retreat through France, brought tears to more than one woman's eyes. They ate in near silence. The only sounds the clinking of utensils against plates and the occasional whispered comment in German. The Canadian guards stood at their posts along the walls, but they weren't watching the prisoners with suspicion. Instead, several of them smiled slightly at the obvious enjoyment the women took in the meal. Private René Dupuis caught Dorothea's eye and nodded encouragingly, as if to say it was acceptable to enjoy the food, that no punishment would come for showing such human weakness as hunger satisfied. But it was the dessert that truly captured everyone's attention. When Mrs. Campbell began serving the individual tarts, placing one before each prisoner with the same care she might show to honored guests, the women stared at the purple filling with open curiosity and barely concealed desire. Dorothea had never seen anything quite like it. The color was deep and rich, almost like wine, but the texture was clearly fruit-based, with whole berries visible beneath a light glaze that caught the lamplight. The crust looked impossibly buttery and flaky, a stark contrast to the dry military rations they had known for so long. Hildegard was the first to taste it. She cut a small piece with her fork, lifted it to her mouth, and closed her eyes as the flavors registered. Her expression transformed from cautious suspicion to something approaching wonder. "Mein Gott," she whispered. "What is this?" The question hung in the air, and Corporal Joseph Crowchild, who had been standing quietly near their table, stepped forward. He was a young man with dark hair and copper skin, his features marking him as different from the other guards. His uniform bore the same Canadian insignia, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of different roots, older connections to this land. "Saskatoon berry pie," he said in careful, slowly pronounced English. The translator began to render it into German, but Corporal Crowchild held up his hand and continued speaking directly to the women, his words simple enough that even those with limited English could follow. "This berry," he gestured to the tarts, "grows on the prairies. My people, the Cree, we have picked these berries for thousands of years, long before Canada, long before Germany, long before this war. The berries remember only the sun and the soil and the seasons. They do not know about enemies." Dorothea found herself leaning forward, captivated not just by the exotic dessert, but by the gentle philosophy in the young corporal's words. She took her first bite of the Saskatoon berry pie, and the taste exploded across her tongue, sweet and tart, and somehow both familiar and completely foreign. The texture was perfect, the berries soft but not mushy, the crust dissolving into buttery layers. Around her, other women were having the same experience, their faces showing the same surprise and delight. The days following that first unexpected meal established a pattern that confused and unsettled the German women more than harsh treatment ever could have. Each morning, they woke to find the wood stove in their barracks already stoked and burning, though none of them had heard anyone enter during the night. Breakfast appeared with regularity: porridge with brown sugar and cream, toast with jam, sometimes even eggs. It was simple fare by peacetime standards, but to women who had spent months eating whatever they could scrounge during the chaotic German retreat, it felt like luxury they didn't deserve and couldn't understand. Sergeant Malcolm Fraser seemed to take personal responsibility for their welfare in ways that went beyond military duty. When he noticed that several of the women were coughing in the cold October air, he arranged for the camp doctor to examine them and personally delivered extra blankets to their barracks. He never made a show of these gestures, never sought gratitude or acknowledgement. He simply did what needed doing with the same practical efficiency he might apply to any farm chore. Dorothea watched him carefully, trying to reconcile this quiet kindness with everything she had been taught about the Allied forces. Private René Dupuis took it upon himself to teach basic English to any prisoner who showed interest. He would sit in the common area during his off-duty hours, a slate board propped on his knee, writing out simple words and phrases. "Good morning, thank you, please, cold, warm, food, water." His patience seemed inexhaustible, and his French-accented English somehow made the foreign words less intimidating. Elfrida proved to have an ear for languages and quickly became his most dedicated student, though Dorothea suspected the young woman's motivation wasn't entirely academic. There was something in how Elfrida's eyes followed the private when he moved through the camp, a cautious hope that transcended the barriers of war and nationality. Mrs. Beatrice Campbell became a fixture in their daily lives, arriving each morning with the dedication of someone fulfilling a sacred duty rather than a volunteer obligation. She brought with her not just food, but small comforts that spoke of a woman's understanding of what other women might need. One day she appeared with a box of donated hair ribbons and pins, modest items in peacetime, but treasures to women who had not been able to properly care for their appearances in months. Another time she brought several well-worn novels in German, explaining through the translator that they had belonged to her late mother, who had immigrated from Austria 40 years earlier. The gesture brought Lieselotte to tears, and even the normally stoic Gertrude had to turn away to compose herself. But perhaps the most surprising kindness came from an unexpected source. Corporal Joseph Crowchild began teaching the women about the prairie landscape that surrounded their camp, the endless grasslands that seemed so alien to women accustomed to European forests and cities. He showed them how to identify different plants, which ones the Cree used for medicine, which ones could be eaten, which ones told stories about the changing seasons. He spoke about his people's connection to this land, how the prairies had sustained his ancestors for generations beyond counting. His lessons were quiet rebellions against the idea that enemies couldn't share knowledge, that war had to poison every human interaction. Dorothea found herself drawn to these teachings, not just for the information itself, but for what it represented about the possibility of understanding between people who were supposed to hate each other. As November arrived and the prairie temperatures dropped, Mrs. Beatrice Campbell made an announcement that would transform the dynamic in the camp even further. She needed help in the kitchen, and she was inviting volunteers from among the prisoners. Captain Whitmore approved the arrangement, seeing it as constructive activity that would ease the boredom and melancholy that often plagued prisoner-of-war camps during the long winter months ahead. What none of them anticipated was how the kitchen would become a classroom where language, culture, and humanity would mix as thoroughly as flour and butter in pie crust. Hildegard was the first to volunteer, her nursing background having given her comfort with practical hands-on work. Elfrida followed quickly, eager for any opportunity to improve her English and perhaps spend more time near Private Dupuy, who often assisted with carrying supplies to the kitchen. Dorothea hesitated initially, uncertain about this strange intimacy with their captors, but ultimately curiosity won over caution. Within a week, 7 of the German women were spending their mornings in the camp kitchen, learning to prepare meals under Mrs. Campbell's patient instruction. The kitchen work required communication that went beyond Private Dupuy's formal English lessons. Mrs. Campbell would demonstrate a technique, kneading bread dough or rolling pie crust, and the women would attempt to replicate it while she corrected them in English they had to learn to understand. Knead it like this, more pressure. No, dear, fold it gently. Don't overwork the dough. Roll from the center outward. Yes, just like that. The words became meaningful through action and repetition, their English vocabulary expanding to include terms they would never have learned from a textbook. But more than language was being exchanged in that warm kitchen. Mrs. Campbell shared stories as she worked, tales of her own mother's immigration to Canada, of learning to adapt Old World recipes to New World ingredients, of building a life in a place that had once seemed impossibly foreign. The women listened with growing recognition, seeing parallels to their own displacement, their own struggles to understand this vast prairie country. In return, they began to share their own stories, tentatively at first, then with increasing openness. Gertrude spoke of her grandmother's Christmas stolen recipe. Lieselotte described the potato pancakes her mother made every Sunday. The turning point came when Mrs. Campbell announced they would make Saskatoon berry pie together, using preserved berries she had brought from her own cellar. She walked them through each step with the reverence of someone passing down sacred knowledge. The women worked side by side with their teacher, their hands covered in flour, purple berry juice staining their fingers. As the pies baked, filling the kitchen with that distinctive, sweet tart aroma, something shifted. They were no longer quite prisoners and captor. They were simply women sharing the universal language of food, the ancient feminine art of creating nourishment and comfort from basic ingredients. When the pies emerged golden and perfect, Mrs. Campbell cut generous slices for everyone. Hildegard took her first bite and smiled, really smiled, for the first time since her capture. "This," she said in halting English, "tastes like hope." December brought snow to the prairies and news from Europe that shattered the fragile peace the German women had built within themselves. Allied forces advancing into Germany had begun liberating concentration camps, and the reports filtering back to Canada carried details so horrific that many refused to believe them initially. Captain Whitmore wrestled with whether to share this information with her prisoners, ultimately deciding that they had a right to know, perhaps even a need to know, what had been done in their country's name. The newspapers arrived in the common room on a gray morning when wind drove snow against the windows in horizontal sheets. Private Dupuy, his face grave, spread them across the table where the women gathered for their English lessons. He didn't translate. At first, simply let them see the photographs, grainy images of skeletal figures behind wire, of mass graves, of horrors that seemed to belong to some medieval nightmare rather than the modern world. The headlines screamed words that needed no translation: Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz. Dorothea felt the room tilt around her as she bent over the newspaper. She had known about labor camps, everyone had known about those, places where enemies of the Reich were sent to work. But this was something else entirely. These weren't workers. They were victims. The photographs showed people who had been systematically starved, worked to death, murdered on an industrial scale. Her hands began to shake so violently, she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Hildegard made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "No," she whispered in German. "This cannot be real. This is propaganda. It must be propaganda." But even as she spoke, her voice carried no conviction. The evidence was too detailed, too consistent across multiple sources. British soldiers, American soldiers, even Russian forces were all reporting the same atrocities. The photographs came from different camps in different regions, but they all told the same impossible, undeniable story. Elfrida turned away from the table and vomited into a waste bin. Gertrude, young Gertrude, who still sometimes seemed more girl than woman, began to weep with the helpless, heaving sobs of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just collapsed. Lieselotte simply sat frozen, her face drained of all color, staring at nothing. Around the room, similar scenes of shock and horror played out as each woman confronted what their country had done, what they had inadvertently served. Dorothea found herself thinking about the cross her mother had given her, the one she still kept in her canvas bag. Her mother had been a devout Lutheran, had raised Dorothea to believe in goodness, in duty, in service to something larger than oneself. How could the same country that had produced Bach and Goethe, that had given the world so much beauty and philosophy, how could that country have also produced this systematic evil? What did it mean that she had worn the uniform, had served the communications corps, had been part of the machinery that enabled these atrocities? That night, no one in the barracks slept. They lay in their cots, listening to each other cry. The weeks following the revelations were the darkest period since the women's arrival at Camp Medicine Hat. They moved through their daily routines mechanically, their faces hollow, with a grief that went beyond personal loss. This was the grief of discovering that everything you believed about yourself, your identity, your very nation, had been built on lies. Many stopped coming to the kitchen. Several refused meals altogether until Captain Whitmore gently but firmly insisted that self-destruction would not atone for anything. It was Mrs. Beatrice Campbell who finally broke through the wall of despair. She arrived one morning in mid-December and announced that her family was hosting Thanksgiving dinner, the Canadian celebration that fell in October, but which her household observed whenever they felt particularly grateful. She wanted to invite 6 of the prisoners to join them. Captain Whitmore approved the unusual request, understanding that these women needed something beyond the camp's wire fences, some glimpse of normal life to remind them that the world contained more than horror. Dorothea was among those selected, along with Hildegard, Elfrida, Gertrude, Lieselotte, and Frida Vogel, a quiet woman who rarely spoke but whose haunted eyes had grown even more distant since the news from Europe. They were transported to the Campbell farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon, the prairie landscape blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled under pale winter sunlight. The farmhouse was modest but warm, smoke rising from its chimney in a straight column against the still air. Mrs. Campbell's husband, George, greeted them with weathered kindness. Their son had died at Dieppe 2 years earlier, fighting against German forces, yet there was no hatred in his eyes when he shook their hands. Their daughter Margaret, a schoolteacher, helped serve the meal with the same gentle efficiency as her mother. The table was laden with roasted turkey, stuffing, vegetables, and all the traditional Canadian Thanksgiving dishes. But it was what sat at the center of the table that made Dorothea's breath catch, a large Saskatoon berry pie, its crust decorated with cut-out leaves, purple filling visible through the vents. Mr. Campbell said grace in English, his voice steady and sincere, thanking God for the food, for peace that would eventually come, and for the opportunity to share their table with strangers who needed kindness. When he finished, Mrs. Campbell translated his words into German, then added her own. "You are not responsible for knowing what you were deliberately kept from knowing. But you are responsible for who you choose to become now with the knowledge you have." The meal was eaten in quiet conversation, with Margaret helping to translate. When the pie was served, still warm from the oven, Gertrude took her first bite and began to cry again. But these were different tears. "This tastes like forgiveness," she whispered. Mrs. Campbell reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "No, dear, this tastes like a future worth choosing. Forgiveness is something you give yourself by deciding to be better than what came before." Spring arrived on the prairies with the sudden intensity characteristic of the region, snow melting almost overnight to reveal earth ready for planting. With the spring of 1945 came news that the war in Europe was ending. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. The Reich that these women had served no longer existed. Captain Whitmore called an assembly in early May to discuss repatriation, procedures, and the German women gathered with faces that reflected not relief, but profound uncertainty about what came next. The captain explained that arrangements were being made to return them to Germany through displaced persons processing centers in Europe. They would be transported by ship within the next 6 to 8 weeks, then released to make their way home to whatever remained of their former lives. She spoke with compassion, acknowledging that many of them faced the prospect of returning to cities that had been bombed into rubble, to families they hadn't heard from in months or years, to a country that would be occupied and divided among the victorious Allies. That evening, the women gathered in their barracks for a discussion that lasted until dawn. They spoke in German, their native language, allowing them to express the complex emotions that English couldn't yet accommodate. Dorothea found herself articulating thoughts she hadn't fully realized she was having. What Germany are we returning to? The cities are destroyed. Our families are scattered or dead. The country we thought we were serving never actually existed. It was a lie built on atrocities we knew nothing about. Hildegard, always practical, raised different concerns. But this is not our home. Canada is a foreign country. We don't truly belong here. We are prisoners, not immigrants. How can we simply choose to stay? Elfrida, who had grown close to Private Dupuy during the months of English lessons and stolen conversations, spoke quietly. Perhaps belonging is not about where you were born. Perhaps it is about where you are allowed to become who you truly are. The debate continued through the night, passionate but never angry. These women had been through too much together to let disagreement divide them now. Lieselotte argued for returning to help rebuild Germany, saying that running away from their country's crimes was cowardice. Gertrude countered that staying in Canada wasn't running away, but choosing to build something new, to show through their lives that Germans could be different than what the world now believed about them. By morning, they had reached no consensus, but they had clarified their individual positions. Dorothea knew with sudden certainty that she wanted to stay in Canada if such a thing were possible. She had found something here that she had never experienced in Germany, the freedom to question, to doubt, to rebuild her understanding of right and wrong without propaganda directing her thoughts. She approached Captain Whitmore later that day with a request that even she recognized was extraordinary. "Captain, is there any possibility, any way at all that some of us might be permitted to remain in Canada rather than return to Germany?" Captain Dorothy Whitmore's response to Dorothea's request was carefully measured. "I cannot promise anything, but I will make inquiries with Ottawa." The Canadian government had established procedures for displaced persons, though nothing specifically addressed prisoners of war who wished to remain in the country that had held them captive. The situation was unprecedented, requiring consultations between military authorities, immigration officials, and politicians who would need to weigh humanitarian concerns against public opinion that might not look kindly on former enemy soldiers being granted residency. While they waited for official word, life in the camp continued, with a strange mixture of routine and anticipation. Mrs. Campbell, upon learning of the women's request, immediately began working with her church to identify potential sponsor families. Under Canadian immigration law, displaced persons needed sponsors who would guarantee housing and employment, ensuring they would not become public charges. The response from the community surprised even Mrs. Campbell. Families who had met the German women during church visits, local farmers who needed help with spring planting, and business owners looking for workers all stepped forward with offers of sponsorship. The Campbell family offered to sponsor Dorothea personally, providing her with a room in their home and helping her find work as a translator. Several churches were receiving correspondence from newly arrived European refugees who needed help navigating Canadian bureaucracy. Private Dupuis, with courage that impressed everyone who knew him, approached his own family about sponsoring Elfrida. His parents, devout Catholics who believed deeply in redemption and second chances, agreed without hesitation. Similar arrangements began falling into place for several other women who wished to stay. But not all of the prisoners wanted to remain in Canada. Hildegard, after much soul-searching, decided she needed to return to Germany to search for her younger sister, who had last been living in Hamburg when the British firebombing raids destroyed much of the city. Lieselotte felt a duty to her mother, who she had learned through Red Cross channels was alive, but living in desperate conditions in the Soviet occupation zone. Gertrude, young and uncertain, ultimately decided to return with the older women, feeling she needed to witness what Germany had become before she could decide where her future lay. The official response from Ottawa arrived in late June. The German women who wished to remain could apply for landed immigrant status under the displaced persons provisions, provided they had Canadian sponsors and could demonstrate means of support. It was not quite the blanket permission they had hoped for, but it was enough. Of the 37 women who had arrived at Camp Medicine Hat in October of 1944, 14 chose to remain in Canada. 23 prepared for repatriation. The day of departure was emotionally wrenching for everyone involved. The women who were leaving and those who were staying embraced with tears streaming down their faces, knowing they might never see each other again. They had survived capture, imprisonment, and the shattering of everything they had believed about their country and themselves. Now they were choosing different paths forward, but all of them carried the same memories of unexpected kindness, of Saskatoon berry pie, and of discovering that enemies could become friends when given the chance. 25 years later, in the summer of 1970, Dorothea Keller Campbell stood in her sunny kitchen in Medicine Hat, teaching her 2 grandchildren how to make Saskatoon berry pie. The kitchen looked out over the same prairie landscape that had seemed so alien when she first arrived as a prisoner of war. But now these rolling grasslands felt more like home than the German streets of her childhood ever had. Her granddaughter Emma, age 10, carefully rolled out the pie dough, while her grandson Thomas, age 8, sorted through the deep purple berries they had picked that morning. Oma, Emma asked, using the German word for grandmother, "Why do you always make such a big deal about this pie? It's just dessert." Dorothea smiled, her hands dusted with flour, her face lined with decades spent under the prairie sun. She had married Mrs. Campbell's nephew in 1948, built a good life as a translator, and raised 2 sons who knew they were Canadian but also carried German heritage without shame. "Because this pie saved my life," she told Emma, "not my physical life, but my soul." "Let me tell you a story." She told them about arriving at the camp as a frightened prisoner, about expecting cruelty and receiving kindness instead, about the night she first tasted Saskatoon berry pie and realized that the propaganda she had been fed was false. She spoke carefully about learning that Germany had committed terrible crimes, about the shame that followed, about wanting to disappear rather than face what her nation had done. And then she told them about the Campbell family's Thanksgiving dinner, about Mrs. Campbell's words that forgiveness comes from choosing to be better than what came before. Thomas listened with the intensity children bring to stories about their grandparents. "So, you were a bad guy?" he asked with 8-year-old directness. Dorothea knelt to his eye level. "I was a person who served bad people without understanding what they truly were. That doesn't make me evil, but it makes me responsible for learning and doing better. That's what this pie represents. Every time I make it, I remember that kindness is stronger than hatred, that people can change, and that home is where you choose to build a life worth living." The pies went into the oven, and the familiar aroma began filling the kitchen. Dorothea thought about the other women who had made different choices. Hildegard had found her sister and became a nurse in West Germany. Elfrida had married René Dupuy and lived just 30 miles away, raising 4 children who spoke both French and German. Some women who returned to Germany never wrote their fates. Unknown. When the pies emerged golden and perfect, Dorothea cut 3 slices. As they ate together, she watched her grandchildren and saw the future she had chosen. They would grow up knowing that people were more than their worst moments, that nations could transcend their darkest chapters, and that something as simple as a purple prairie berry could carry the taste of redemption. The Saskatoon berries, as Corporal Crowchild had told her long ago, remembered only the sun and soil. They didn't know about enemies, and in that forgetting, in that sweet, tart taste of a land that welcomed her, Dorothea had found not just a home, but a way to finally forgive herself.